Welcome to the Shorewood Public Library Boswell Book Company virtual event series. For Boswell, it is day 4,373 of us being in business. I'm Daniel Golden, the proprietor of Boswell, and I am so excited to be joined by Haley Johnson, a librarian at Shorewood Public Library, who has a few words for us. Haley?
Hello, everyone, and thank you for coming tonight. My name is Haley Johnson, and I'm the Community and Adult Services Librarian at the Shorewood Public Library. Tonight, I'm pleased to co-host tonight's author event featuring Jeannée Sacken in conversation with Rochelle Melander. So thank you all for coming. I'm going to pass it back to Daniel.
Thank you, Haley. We are so excited to be hosting an evening with Jeannée Sacken for Behind the Lens, her novel that is as suspenseful as it is photogenic, I should say. The Kirkus called her new book a gripping Afghan tale starring a strong hero wielding a camera. And her conversation partner chimes in to say, not only does the story take readers on an adventure behind the lens and into Annie's life, it transports them into the heart of Afghanistan, into a battle for equality, freedom, and justice. Tonight's author, Jeannée Sacken, is an English professor turned photojournalist who travels the world documenting the lives of women and children. She lives in Shorewood with her husband and cat, and she is also president of the Friends of the Shorewood Public Library. Tonight, she'll be in conversation with Rochelle Melander, writing coach, artist, educator, and writer, of course, whose debut book for kids is Mightier Than the Sword, Rebels, Reformers, and Revolutionaries Who Changed the World Through Writing. We are very excited as that book will be coming out in July. Welcome to both Jeannée and Rochelle. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having us. So let's dig in. I'm so excited about your book. Can you tell us a little bit about Behind the Lens?
Yeah. First, I would like to thank Daniel Golden and the Boswell Book Company for helping me have a dream come true. And I'd also like to thank Haley Johnson and the Shorewood Public Library. And Boswell Books and the Shorewood Public Library are two of my favorite places in the world. And I have seen a lot of the world. I'd also like to thank everybody who is on Zoom for taking their time this evening to tune in and listen to us chat, and I hope come up with some questions to pose to us. Behind the Lens is suspenseful women's fiction. Annie Hawkins Green is a seasoned war photographer who is embedded with the coalition forces in Afghanistan. She exploits a photographic moment in a small village that leads to horrific consequences, or at least she thinks she's responsible for what happens, and she feels enormous guilt. Years later, she returns to Afghanistan to teach a photography workshop at the secondary school for girls run by her expat best friend. And this is her means of seeking redemption. However, as she soon discovers, nothing and no one are what they seem to be.
Wow. Well, maybe you can read a little bit for us so we can get a sense of what it sounds like.
Well, thank you. I shall do that. And I must say, I asked a couple of people what I should read, and you said one thing, and everybody else said exactly the same scene. Some people even quoted it to me. So that's the scene I'm going to read. This is a scene about a third of the way through the book. Annie has returned to Afghanistan to teach this workshop, and her friend Daria's husband Tariq drives to Kabul to pick her up. at the hotel where she's staying, and they are now on their way from Kabul up through the peaceful Panjshir Valley, and they have just stopped at the Dalan Sang checkpoint. I go back to scrolling through my snaps. I zoom in on a driver's eyes, closed. On to the next image. This driver's looking out the window toward the river. The next image. I've magnified the driver's face only a few degrees when I see it. He's staring straight at me. No, into me, through me. He's not bored, far from it. His long hair and scraggly beard draw my attention for a moment, but it's those piercing eyes, that tightness of his mouth. I know that look. It's almost a cliche of fanaticism. Eyes like I saw back in my Masamgar and Kakwali days. Fingers trembling, I crop and magnify the angry eyes. Tariq, we're rounding a bend where the road is precariously narrow, but Tariq risks a glance in my direction. Wordlessly, I turn the camera so he can see the picture on the screen. He cups his hand over the top of the image to get a better view, then looks sharply at me. When did you take this? A few minutes ago, just before we got to the checkpoint. He's a couple cars behind. Tariq looks ahead to the tanker still inching forward. They could be working together, the truck driver and the driver behind us. I've seen this before. They slow down the line of traffic, hoping for the maximum number of casualties. He pulls the car as close as he can to the rock face and turns off the ignition. He's halfway out his door, ready to run back and warn people when the blast erupts, blocking out the roar of the river. The car shakes, rises slightly off the ground, then drops. The air is sucked from my lungs. The cracked windshield explodes outward into a million tiny slivers. Then shards of metal and tiny chunks of burning rubber rain down on us. I slide off the seat and onto the floor, arms over my head, waiting. Another blast will come. That's the way these guys work. Wait for people to run to help, then detonate another bomb or two. The tanker ahead of us, they could be working together. Oh God, what if there's a bomb in that truck with all that fuel? It will take out this section of the road, maybe trigger an avalanche. He'll kill us all and cut off the entire valley from Kabul. That's the plan. It's got to be. I wait and wait, praying Tariq is still alive, but no second blast detonates. I wait for the river to roar again, but all I can hear is a loud ringing, shrill and constant. I climb over the center console and out the driver's door. Tariq is lying face down on the road, a bloodied arm above his head. Tariq, get back in the car. Your arm. It's not mine, he yells.
Well, thank goodness he's okay.
Yes, he's fine.
Wow. So, whew, that was a ride. So someone asked a question, and I think it's a good one to answer right away. When is the book set, or what's the time frame of the story?
The first chapter is in 2006, at the height of the coalition forces being in various places around Afghanistan. In that first chapter, Annie is at Forward Operating Base Masamgar. It is near Kandahar in the southern part of Afghanistan. And then the rest of the book takes place in 2015 when she returns to Afghanistan.
Thank you. I think that helps readers. So the book is fiction, but like the main character, you're a photojournalist and you've traveled around the world. Can you talk a little bit about the parts of the book that are autobiographical?
Well, Annie has red hair. I have red hair. She's a photographer, but a war photographer. I am a photographer, but a photojournalist. And we both travel a lot. I have had some of the experiences that Annie has had, but in a different context. I was photographing black-maned lions in the Kalahari Desert when I became quite ill and had to be medevaced out by helicopter. So I've been helivaced out of a dangerous situation. I was in Namibia when suddenly in the middle of the night, 3 o'clock in the morning, the lodge I was staying in erupted in flames, and it sounded like bombs were going off. And so I got to sit in a Jeep and watch this horrific fire. So I've taken a number of personal experiences that I've had, and I've recast them into Annie's experiences in Afghanistan.
So were you ever in Afghanistan?
Nope, never in Afghanistan.
So, okay. So I know, because we had coffee for many years, that Annie Hawkins Green started out as a character in a whole different story. So what prompted you, or what inspired you to give her this new story?
Well, I wrote the original book 15, 14 years ago, and I thought it was great. But then as I read it over and over and over, I realized it just wasn't hanging together. I had written it from multiple points of view, and Annie Hawkins Green was a lawyer, and she was working for the United Nations, and she was in Mexico investigating the deaths of women in the maquiladoros, all of these factories that are in Ciudad Juarez. And the book just wasn't hanging together. It just wasn't working. So I parked it on my shelf, right there, as a matter of fact. And there it sat for probably 10 years. And I was working on other projects, and I eventually literally picked it up and said, well, let's figure out what I like about this book. And what I liked was Annie Hawkins Green. And but I totally recast her. I think the only thing that was the same was her red hair. Mm-hmm. And she, I had her get divorced. I had her have a child who's a teenager. And I decided she was a war photographer, so she needed a war. And I needed a war where there was a US military presence. And it all narrowed down to Afghanistan. Mm. So it was a big redo.
Yeah, can you talk a little bit about that? The process of moving, a character you love from one story to another story. Do you get to keep a little bit of the first novel, or do you basically just start over from scratch?
Well, I've done this before, and I have kept a lot of the previous novel in other projects. In this one, it was pretty much a complete redo. I kept her name, I kept her hair color, I kept the college she went to, some of the background details, but otherwise it really was a complete redo.
Wow.
And, there's an adage when you're a writer, kill your darlings. And I did, big time.
So let's talk about the love part of it, because I like that part. So Behind the Lens is suspenseful women's fiction, and there's a lot of suspense. We got that when you read to us. But there's also this love story element, and it happens on a couple of different levels between different characters. Do you want to talk a little bit about the romance in the book?
I'd love to. I see a number of different love stories, and First and foremost, there is this love between Annie and her best friend, Darya Faludi, who emigrated from Kabul, Afghanistan, when she was a young child, as did one of my college roommates. And she and Annie are in college together. They are roommates all 4 years. They remain very, very close friends. And Darya decides eventually that the best thing she can do is return to Afghanistan, because she believes that change and bringing Afghanistan into the 21st century has to happen by Afghans from within the country. It can't be imposed on them. And she goes back, and Annie is furious, but they maintain their friendship. And so there is a lot of push and pull that goes on. The second love story is, well, Annie comes home from being on assignment, and her daughter, who normally lives with her father and stepmother, is in Annie's apartment with a teenage boy. And her shirt is on inside out. And Annie assumes that there is some kind of sexual relationship going on. And she and her daughter have a fight about this. And it turns out to be reasonably innocent. But Annie's worried about it. The third love story is going on when Annie gets to Afghanistan. And love is very different in Afghanistan, especially among traditional families. And when teenage boys and teenage girls want to get together, it can be very, very dangerous, and it can be considered dishonorable for families. Now, of course, Darya and Tariq have been Americanized. So there isn't that fear that their 17-year-old daughter could be dishonoring the family. However, when Annie gets there, she starts to suspect that their 17-year-old daughter, Seema, is sneaking around with a shadowy boy. And Annie is trying to sort things out. And when she finally gets Seema to open up, that story is about as ugly as stories can get. But I think the love story you're going for is the one between Annie and Finn Sorelli. Back in the first chapter, you meet Finn Sorelli. He is a U.S. Navy SEAL commander. He is the one who rescues Annie when she gets in a very precarious situation in the first chapter. And she basically gets set up with him much later on when she returns to Afghanistan, set up by her best friend, Darya. And I had a lot of fun with that. I wanted to bend the genre a little and put some romance in for some plot reasons. And also, I liked the idea of also bending gender roles as well as genre. So.
Well, I love Sorelli. So just so you know, in case you are writing more books, right?
I am, and he returns.
Yay, I can't wait. So in the story, the characters make use of this kind of interesting love poem format. Do you want to talk a little bit about how you discovered those and what they are?
Landaise. Landaise, I was actually researching recipes. And I think I was researching how to make rot, which is a sweet Afghan tea bread. And somehow the word rot turned into Landaise. And anyway, serendipity, I suddenly had this wonderful story about Landaise staring at me from my computer screen. And I discovered that Landaise are 2-line poems. They're 22 syllables, and they are part of a very rich Pashtun literary tradition. And the Pashto are one of the tribes in Afghanistan. And this is an oral tradition, and it has been around for hundreds of years. The people who composed these Landaise were women, exclusively women. And because the Pashtun felt it was dishonorable for women to be able to read or write, they were never allowed to learn, but women had emotions and feelings that they wanted to express to their beloved. And because marriage in Pashtun tribal culture was strictly a tribal business deal, love had no part in it, but women still loved these beloveds. And so they would sing these songs to a drum beat to their beloved. If they were ever caught singing them, composing them, it was considered dishonorable to the family. And there were many honor killings for that. And this is a literary tradition that continues to this day. And in fact, 2 books that I found, which Boswell Books special ordered for me. One is called I Am the Beggar of the World. And they're collections of Landaise that Westerners have gone in and found and collected because they're still not written down. However, as recently as 2017, one of the main Landaise composers, a woman, had acid thrown on her when her brothers found out that she was composing Landaise because it dishonored the family. And she was hospitalized and subsequently took her own life. The other interesting thing is that other groups, the Dari, the Tajiks, are also now, they are writing Landaise. And young people are writing them, boys and girls. So it's not just exclusively girls and women anymore. And they're calling them into radio talk shows late at night. And they will have an agreed upon pseudonym, one name, and hope that no one in their family recognizes their voice. And this is their way of communicating with their beloved.
That is so sweet. So tell me how you spell Landaise.
Landay.
Awesome.
And I use Landaise in this book in a couple of different ways. First, I use it as a plot device. This is the way that Annie discovers that her friend's daughter, Seema, is sneaking out. Because she leans out her bedroom window, Annie does, and sees a piece of paper in the mulberry bush, opens it, and here is this Landaise. And then throughout the story, these Landaise, it's like a post office, this mulberry bush, and the Landaise get put in the bush, and there's a white piece of paper, and then there's a blue piece of paper, and the two, Seema and her young man, are answering each other. So that is how, when Annie is monitoring the activities between these two, which start out fairly innocent, that she realizes that they are building to a crisis between the two.
Wow.
I also have Sorelli writing Lundays, and that was a lot of fun to have this character who is this big, rough and tough SEAL, U.S. Navy SEAL, who happens to write beautiful love poems.
Wow.
So that also, in a way, tracks the narrative of their love story.
So thank you. I wanted to talk a little bit about the themes in the book. There's just, there's many themes that you weave together: juggling career and motherhood, nurturing women's friendships, supporting young women, trust and betrayal. Do you want to talk about how you started to weave in so many themes, or how they emerged?
Well, Annie feels a lot of guilt. She is juggling a really high power career where she's not at home a lot, but I also wanted her to have a daughter. And there is a bit of backstory that shifts back and forth, where she tries to decide if she should give up her career or not, or if she should continue forward. And then her husband makes the decision for her. He issues an ultimatum. And at this point, I wasn't quite sure where I was going to go with this. And so I literally just let the characters talk for a while. And originally I had the daughter be 5 or 6. And then one of the reasons I jumped forward so far in time was that I really liked the idea of the daughter becoming a teenager. But Annie, as a mother, still is feeling guilty about leaving her daughter all the time, but not enough to give up her career, because she feels she is also doing what she is supposed to be doing, what she is good at doing. And although I don't have children, everyone I spoke to said this is a constant theme in their lives. If they are away from their child, or if they're even thinking of going away from the child, that there is always this feeling of, I should be with my child. So literally, this teenage daughter wanted a bigger role. And so, although there are 2 chapters near the beginning of the book where we see Annie and Mel, her daughter, together arguing over this boy, and then arguing because Annie is not going to be able to attend an event that Mel wants her to attend, the majority of her interaction with her daughter comes through phone calls, because the daughter starts having a crisis while Annie is away. And so that just got a bigger and bigger role. I was going to have one phone call, and then there was another phone call, and it kept evolving. Nurturing the women's friendships. The most important friendship is between Annie and Darya. And originally I figured there was a lot of conflict in this book. I didn't need to have a lot of conflict between Annie and Darya. But I literally had an agent who was considering the book call me. And she spent several hours on the phone with me, talking to me about why I needed to rewrite Darya and Annie's relationship, and that I needed to have a lot more pushback between the 2 women. And so after that conversation, Darya really went from being a secondary character to a primary character. And what I wanted throughout was for Annie especially to feel she knew Darya really, really well. And then to find out that there are some secrets that she discovers at the end. And So it always had that ending, but the relationship between the two women really evolved, and I think became much richer and has much more depth.
So, you know, I was impressed at how you were managed to weave so many themes together. And one of your, by the way, no spoilers, someone asked.
Oh dear. Okay.
I found it interesting how the plot became more mysterious and confusing as you read into the middle of the book. It keeps the reader wondering about each character's motives. Was this difficult to create? It was fascinating and exciting. And so and that was really my question. How did you juggle all the storylines and pacing? And was that hard to do?
I would love to say that it was really hard to do. And I would love to turn my screen around and show you a big whiteboard on my wall covered with all of these narrative arcs that I was following, or to say that I used Scrivener and had all these things blocked out. I just sort of kept it all in my head.
Wow.
And which was hard, but that's how I did it. I mean, there were revisions. So the first book really looks nothing like what the book is now. In the first book, I had two narrative arcs. One was Annie's memories, and one was the present story. And the chapters would interweave. And that ended up not working. So what I ended up doing was taking key memory chapters and either writing them into the present story or doing fairly tight flashbacks that were pretty well integrated. A lot of the atmosphere that's going on is because we spend a lot of time in Annie's head. And Annie has undiagnosed PTSD, which is a real issue with journalists, as is death, a real issue among journalists in war zones. And, you know, journalists often will say that what keeps them going is this adrenaline rush that they get through surviving. And it's the survival that gets them to want to go back again. But especially with the Taliban and ISIS and Al-Shabaab, there are more and more journalists who aren't surviving. And there are a lot of journalists who are suffering from PTSD. And so a great deal of what happens once Annie gets to Wad Cole, she starts having hallucinations. And I'm sorry if that's a spoiler, but she's never quite sure what's a nightmare and what's a PTSD hallucination and what's really happening.
Well, that's good. That's helpful. So I know you're a reader and a researcher, and I'm curious about what books helped you understand this genre, this kind of romantic suspense, or yeah. So what would you say? Are there other novels like this that were really inspiring to you?
I read all of Suzanne Brockman. I read Tasha Alexander. I read Anna Lee Huber, Dorothy Sayers, Linda Castillo, Deanne Rayburn. They're complete series. And, you know, some of them are more suspenseful. Some of them are more romance. I would say that I didn't find any suspenseful women's fiction with a dollop of romance.
Mm.
But I also, I read a lot of books set in Afghanistan, and they would have bits of suspense, bits of thriller, bits of romance. I also read a number of war books, and this is not a war story, but I wanted to see how different authors handle PTSD, handle soldiers in war zones, handle journalists in war zones.
So someone asked my next question, which is great. I have to tell you that when I read the book, I would immediately reach for my computer whenever somebody ate something and then search for the recipes of the food, because you talk about, I think it was the breakfast dish that most intrigued me. And I was like, well, what does that look like? I couldn't picture in my head what they were eating. So do you want to talk a little bit about how you researched the food in the novel, and maybe if you cooked any of it?
Well, I have an extensive cookbook collection. I used to have a pantry that was a walk-in pantry. It is now all cookbooks. It is a room full of cookbooks. So I started there. From there, I learned that the internet is my friend, which I'd known for a long time. I also started, I got a list of restaurants in Kabul, and I started researching them online, and they actually post menus in Dari, written in Dari and in English. And so I found a lot of things there, and then started cross-referencing to find recipes, a lot of which my husband ate over and over as I kept cooking them. I also found two wonderful websites. One is called Unicorns in the Kitchen, and the other is Afghan Culture Unveiled. And both of these are done by Afghan women, one in the United States, the other in Kabul. And so I hear from them every week. And that's where the recipes come from.
And what is that thing they eat for breakfast? It's called rote?
Rote, R-O-A-T. And it's a tea bread. You can have it for breakfast. Often an Afghan breakfast is a very full meal. It can have eggs and vegetables and naan. But when Annie and Daria are having breakfast together, it's a more westernized breakfast. So typically rote would be served with tea, probably in the afternoon.
Thank you. Now I feel so much more fulfilled. Another question, you've traveled all over the world, but never Afghanistan, and you've been a photographer in so many places. But again, I don't think you've ever worked with the military, as I remember, but maybe I'm wrong. So how did you research those parts of the books?
Well, the military. I am very fortunate that my brother, one of my two brothers, is a former U.S. naval officer. And he was a font of information. It was wonderful. And I got a lot of the military speak from him. He lives in Virginia, and he and I would both go to visit our mother in New Jersey. And as she took naps, I would just get him to tell all of these stories about things that happened while he was serving in the Navy. And he also did a long stint in the Persian Gulf. And so I got a lot of information from him about that. He was the person who said, you really need to get onto a Navy destroyer. Mm. And so that happened. I also subscribe to various newsletters put out by the US military, the Marines, the SEALs, the Navy, and various veterans groups. And so you put all that together. As far as Afghanistan is concerned, I have always loved reading novels set in Afghanistan. And so that was my foundation. And then I gradually discovered the wealth, the literary wealth in Afghanistan. And so I was discovering proverbs and landays and other poets. And so I was trying to weave as much of that in as possible. I also read a book by Rob Norland called The Lovers, which is nonfiction, and it tracks two people from two different tribes who fall in love and get married, and it goes through all of the turbulence these two young people went through trying to stay married and not have their families kill either one of them. So that was some excellent firsthand information. And then the last major component, this is not a book about Islam, but Afghanistan is an Islamic country. I am not Muslim. And so I really felt that I needed to do a lot of work. And I started by meeting with people from the Masjid Al-Huda in South Milwaukee. And then toward the end, well, it was actually in book production when I made contact with the Muslim Public Affairs Council Hollywood Bureau, and they found me Heba El-Kobaitri, who is a cultural and Islamic sensitivity reader. And so I worked with her because I was determined to be as authentic as possible. I really wanted to get my portrayal of Muslims right. So those were some of the things that I did.
Oh, that's awesome. So what did you learn about yourself as a result of writing this book?
You know, one of the things I learned is writing is we all say writing is a solitary act. However, it really took a community for me to get this book written. You and I would talk about it over tea many, many times. I have a writing group, and various members of the writing group read through the entire manuscript. Judy Bridges read through it. Sarah Rattan read through the manuscript, and with a fine-tooth line editing comb went through it. I have a writing partner, Roy Salberg, who lives in California, but she started out living in Madison, and we just kept our writing partnership going. And then I had a wonderful team to work with for book production. I'd also like to give a shout out to Shauna Singh Baldwin, who, when she read the book in the ARC form, made some incredible finds and suggestions. And they were very, very helpful. So I really did learn that writing starts out solitary, but for me at least, I needed that community.
Wow.
So the other thing that I learned about myself is that I'm a cinematic writer. And I had never thought about that before. I think my writing is very cinematic, very visual. So
no, it's perfect, because someone, that was my next question for you. Someone said this book is very cinematic. Have you thought about adapting it for film?
I would love to have it adapted for film. I am not a screenwriter, however. I taught screenwriting when I was teaching college, and I learned I am not a screenwriter. I was sort of the one stuck doing it.
So there's this beautiful thing in here. And I think that's what they meant. Can you talk about the cultural significance of the crescent moon tattoo that's in the book?
Oh, well, the crescent moon figures throughout the book, both visually, and the visual part of having that crescent moon is it is a traditional way of creating Arabic and Muslim texts to have an imprint at the beginning of a chapter and at the end of the chapter. And so I very much wanted to have that particular symbol because it does figure throughout the book thematically, and I can't say how else because I will spoil. So, but it does figure prominently at the end of the book. At any rate, my editor and I went on a search for the perfect crescent moon, and we found this beautiful, elaborate moon with all of these arabesques in the moon and this beautiful bouquet of flowers on the side. And the publisher and the artist, Kaylee, who designed the cover, didn't like it. They said it was too pretty and that the book is not a pretty book. It is an edgy book, a raw book. There are ugly moments in the book. And so they felt it needed to be roughed up. And so Kaylee took off the bouquet of flowers, and I'm yelling, no, I love the flowers. And she roughed it up, and it's perfect. They were absolutely right. It is perfect the way it is now.
Oh, that's awesome. So someone wondered what you meant about a writing partnership, and what's the concept of that?
A writing partnership is in some ways like a best friend, a marriage, and your writing coach all rolled into one. It has to be someone that you absolutely trust. And what we do, and this is long distance because I'm in Milwaukee and she's in Northern California, we exchange chapters, parts of chapters, whole manuscripts. We also get together on Zoom and talk through plotting problems and just work our way through it. And we're each working on a manuscript. So it's a wonderful relationship.
So someone asked that, and we talked about this a little before, but I think it's a little bit different question. You talked that certain aspects of your previous draft really didn't work. So how did you know? What was your sense that wasn't working and you needed to change it?
Well, it was really interesting because I had a number of beta readers at that point, and I was also workshopping it in a roundtable, and the people in roundtable loved it. But there was a real split among my beta readers. And, I think you often, when you get feedback in that's negative, my first impulse was to curl up and say, they don't get it. They just don't get it. And then I thought about it more, and I realized that I was trying to interweave 3 stories. Annie's story, the story of one of the maquiladoras who ends up being murdered, kidnapped and murdered, and then her younger sister who was looking for them. And it was off balance because, you know, maybe I should have been telling the maquiladora's story, but I didn't feel comfortable telling that story unless it was from the point of view of a white American woman, because otherwise I felt like I was writing somebody else's story. But it was out of balance. And I think that the interrelationships among these 3 women were too tangential. And I just couldn't get an organic enough relationship. And so when I finally realized that, and I set it aside, I still really liked Annie. And so that was when I decided that I need to have her story completely from her point of view.
That's great. So I'm curious, you have a PhD, you used to be a professor. So I'm wondering that if during those years when you were teaching and grading, did you always want to write novels? And how did that work prepare you for becoming a novelist?
As a professor, you have a huge teaching responsibility. I was also running a program, and that's a full-time job. And anybody who teaches writing and is conferencing all the time with students knows you're putting in a good 60 hours a week. Then you're expected to publish or perish. And universities often have strict rules as to what is acceptable for publishing. And unless you're teaching creative writing, it's not really acceptable to have creative writing as part of your portfolio for promotion and tenure. So I had done creative writing before, but I put a lot of it on the back burner when I was teaching. And once I got up in ranks and was at a senior level, I said, you know, let's go back to some creative writing. And I went to creative nonfiction, which I had never written before. And I would write these, I don't think my husband even knows this. I wrote an entire manuscript of creative nonfiction. And I was living in Rochester, New York at the time, and there were a number of wonderful bookstores. And one of the things they did was they would have writers' nights, and you would open mic night. And I would go and I would read these essays at open mic night. And they were pretty funny. And then I left academia and I got involved in creative fiction. While I was teaching, what I came to learn that has really stood me in good stead is when you are teaching, communication is everything. And your sense of audience is everything. You have to know your students, especially when you are working, as I was, with deaf students. And signing, which is not my native language, and it was something that I had to learn on the job in order to do. And so that learning of a new language, that needing to be so attuned to my students, my audience, who were coming at me with a whole different background. So I really needed to get into their shoes as well. And that is something that has really carried over for me in writing.
somebody wanted to know what a beta reader was.
You know, I think there are various definitions of beta readers. Mine is after you have written the book, workshopped the book, revised, you find a couple of readers or a handful of readers who would typically read your book, who would typically pick it up off the shelf at Boswell and say, yeah, I really want to read this book. And you get them to read it before it's published, and you find out what they think of it. And so it's pretty far along in the process. I know other people have beta readers, which I would call more as workshopping. But for me, it's a beta reader is pretty far along in the process. I have two of the best beta readers, and these people are not, they're readers. They may have some writing experience, but they are really there to be reading it and not necessarily giving writerly feedback. Nancy Backus and Elizabeth Jonas, fabulous beta readers.
Oh, that's cool. And one of your fans, Judy Bridges, said, I hope you hear your whole village out here cheering for you.
Thank you, village.
Cool. And there are a few questions that I'm not going to ask because they contain little tidbits of spoilers in it. So I don't even want to go there. So you clearly care about educating young people. And you know, that's a topic near and dear to my heart. And so I really love that whole theme of Annie traveling to Afghanistan to teach photography to a girls' school. So do you want to talk a little bit about why that's an important topic to you and why you included that in the book?
Well, education is something I have felt passionately about my entire life. I'm a former professor. And there are so many places in this world where people cannot get an education, but specifically girls and women. And one of those places is Afghanistan. And during the Taliban years, the Taliban perverted the Quran and said that the Quran says women and girls are not allowed to get any kind of education, are not allowed to read and write. And the Taliban came out of the Pashtun tribal areas. And so you can see that historical carryover of girls and women are not allowed to be educated. They're not allowed to read or write. And so for a decade, women and girls sat at home. And although the Taliban said, well, girls under the age of 8 can read the Quran, but they can't learn how to read. So that was a little odd. When the Taliban were defeated and an Afghan government came into being, one of the first things that the new president promised was girls could go back to school. However, the Taliban had burned many of the girls' schools specifically. And also there was this little catch-22. Well, once a girl reaches puberty, she cannot be taught by male teachers. She must have female teachers. Well, there was a whole generation lost of women who couldn't get an education. And therefore, there were very few female teachers. Even today, 80% of teachers in Afghanistan are male. 20% are female. I created this lovely, wonderful secondary school for girls. There are very few secondary schools for girls. And girls often have to walk long distances to get there. They risk having acid thrown at them. They risk being stoned. They risk being shot. Remember Malala in the Northwest Territories in Pakistan, which is also under a lot of Taliban control. She was shot taking a bus to school. And So something has to be done. And unfortunately, we now have these negotiations with the Taliban, who look like they will have a big voice. They already have a big voice. Less than 70 kilometers outside of the city of Kabul, it is the Taliban who are in charge of education. They are, the government pays the salaries, but the Taliban are in charge of designing curriculum. And the head of Taliban education says, girls are not allowed to be educated. This is what the Quran says.
Wow. So do you want to say something about how the proceeds from this novel are going to help girls and women?
Well, a portion of the proceeds will be donated to several different organizations, including Women for Women International, who focus on educating women so that they can work and provide for their families. There is also the Global Fund for Women, which supports women and girls. And it's not just Afghanistan. I mean, there are countries all over that are facing this same thing. And one of the problems I just mentioned that girls face is just the sheer danger of getting from home to school and back again at the end of the day. And so one of the things that some of these charities are doing is building boarding schools for girls so that they do not have to thread that danger every day and risk their lives going to school and coming home from school. Another one of the programs is to provide at-home educational programs for teenage girls to get them to the point where they can enter a school at age. So my husband and I have long supported these organizations, and we just think it's, I'm able to do this. It's the right thing to do, I think. And yes, these characters are fictional, but some of them are based on reality. And so I want to give back to these women and girls.
Oh, that's great. So we're getting towards the time of our last questions. There's one question in the chat that I want to ask, and then I have a question. So if anybody out there has something they're dying to know, please put it in the chat now. So someone asked, are you still working as a photojournalist? I noticed you went to Madagascar. Can you talk about that? And have any of your recent assignments provided material for a new novel or something else you're writing?
I'd love to talk about, yes, I am still a working photojournalist, and I'd love to talk about Madagascar. And I do have images. My photographic work is on my website, which is myname.com. And, but one of the places that is nearest and dearest to my heart is Zimbabwe. And I know you want to hear about Madagascar. However, I'm currently working on the third book in the Annie Hawkins Green series, and it is set in Zimbabwe. And 2 years ago, my husband and I went on a photo shoot to photograph the great elephant migration of there are tens and tens and tens of thousands of elephants that migrate twice a year across the Kaza frontier from Botswana down through Hwange National Park in search of water and food. And they know these migratory routes because they have been handed down from matriarch to matriarch. And so there we were, tens of thousands of elephants and us, and photographing them. And so Annie Hawkins Green ends up in Zimbabwe, and I can't tell you why, but she starts off as part of a documentary film crew of making a documentary on the Great Elephant Migration, and things happen.
So you kind of answered my last question.
Sorry.
That's okay. Just like tell us, when is book 2 coming out? Because you've talked about book 3. We've got book 1. So there's something missing here. What happened with book 2?
Book 2 is titled Double Exposure. Annie returns to Afghanistan, but nobody wants a spoiler. So all I can tell you is Annie returns to Afghanistan.
That's all we need. And you have no date? So any like...
I think that like a year from now.
Okay.
I think is what the publisher is thinking.
That's awesome. So that was my last question. If there are any other burning questions, feel free to throw it in the chat. Otherwise, I think we're good. This has been so amazing.
Rochelle, you have been wonderful.
Oh, thank you. So have you.
Thank you. And Daniel and Haley, thank you for having me tonight.
Thank you.
An honor. And we're looking forward to Rochelle's book in July.
Yes.
Yay! And your book next year. Or whenever the publisher says it's coming out.
Okay.
We also wanted to thank everybody for coming out tonight, because we wouldn't have a virtual library and bookstore without you. So hope to see you at another event.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for hosting us, Daniel.